A 6-year-old boy, residing 700 kilometers from Istanbul, had never stepped foot in the city. His family had never known any Armenians. Yet this child began recounting implausible particulars about the life of a wealthy Armenian man who had died in Istanbul 50 years before he was born, details no one knew until an Australian researcher chose to investigate. This is the true account of Kemal Atasoy, a case that stunned the global scientific community. It was examined by Dr. Jürgen Keil from the University of Tasmania, who had to travel to Istanbul 3 times to verify the impossible. Picture the scene. An Australian psychologist sitting in the living room of a middle-class Turkish household, listening as a boy describes, with exactness, a 3-story home on the waterfront in Istanbul, a house next to that of a famous woman, a house with a church behind it, a residence where a prosperous man from the Caracas family lived who carried a large leather suitcase and stayed there only in the summer months. How could a child who had never been to Istanbul know such things? How could he know the surname of a specific Armenian family? How could he depict a house that truly existed yet had been abandoned for decades? Dr. Keil wondered the same, and so he resolved to do something that would forever shift our understanding of reincarnation. Go to Istanbul and scrutinize every detail the boy had provided. What he uncovered would rattle your notions of life and death. When science collides with the impossible, sometimes the impossible prevails. Are you prepared for a journey that will take you from the mountains of Turkey to the storied streets of Istanbul, a quest for the truth behind one of the best documented reincarnation cases in history? Then take a deep breath, because this narrative will move you in ways you never anticipated. Atasoy was an ordinary child, living with his parents in a Turkish town far from any major urban center. His parents were moderately Muslim, a milieu that, indeed, accepts the idea of rebirth, yet even so, they paid little heed to the unusual accounts the boy had been sharing since the age of 2. And what accounts they were. Kemal asserted that, before he was born, he had been a wealthy man living in Istanbul, not just any man, but an Armenian Christian from the Caracas family. He described a life of comfort, an imposing 3-level residence built literally over the water where boats and skiffs moored in front of the property. The particulars, however, grew even more specific and more implausible. Kemal stated that this house stood beside the home of a very famous woman named Keil, a well-known figure throughout Turkey who had left the country due to legal troubles. He said that behind his house there was a church and that his wife and children bore Greek names. Most intriguing of all was when Kemal spoke about work. He said the Caracas family ran a leather goods business and that he himself always carried a large brown leather suitcase, a detail no one would deem important until its relevance emerged. Another point that drew attention was Kemal's insistence that he lived in that house only part of the year, specifically during the summer, and spent the remainder elsewhere. His parents listened with a mix of amusement and perplexity. He was an exceptionally bright child, yes, but how could he invent such precise details about a city he had never visited, about an Armenian community that no longer existed in Istanbul, about people who had lived decades before his birth? Kemal's family was simple and hardworking. They had never lived among Armenians. His father had been to Istanbul only twice on brief business trips. His mother and Kemal had never set foot in the city. From where could this information have come? That was when fate put in their path a man who would change everything. In 997, Dr. Jürgen Keil, a psychologist at the University of Tasmania in Australia, was conducting research on reincarnation cases in Turkey. He was a rigorous scholar, skeptical by disposition, specialized in experimental psychology. He had heard about the boy who claimed to have lived in Istanbul as a wealthy Armenian. When Dr. Keil sat down in the Atasoy family's modest living room, accompanied by his interpreter, he did not expect to find anything beyond an elaborate childish fancy. Children spin tales all the time. Yet as he listened, something in the boy's steady tone, the richness of detail, and the internal consistency began to unsettle the researcher. The child did not hesitate, did not revise facts, did not appear to be inventing on the spot. He spoke like someone who knew. He spoke of Istanbul as if he had genuinely lived there. He described routes, locations, and architectural features as though reliving memories. Dr. Keil took meticulous notes. 3-story house right on the water, near Eagle's residence. Church behind the property. Caracas family. Leather trade. Brown leather suitcase. Wife of Greek origin. Summer residence only. Death in 940 or 94. Upon leaving the Atasoy home, Dr. Keil faced a decision. He could file the case away as another fanciful tale and move on, or he could do what few investigators dare, subject the child's claims to scientific testing. He chose the latter. His first trip to Istanbul would be akin to searching for a needle in a haystack. Istanbul is vast, with millions of inhabitants. How could he find traces of an Armenian man who had supposedly died more than half a century earlier? And even if he located the vaguely described house, would that prove anything? Yet Dr. Keil had an edge. The mention of the famous woman, Egil. If he could find her residence, it might point to the neighboring property. Thus began one of the most fascinating inquiries in the annals of reincarnation research. Can you imagine what Dr. Keil discovered in Istanbul? Brace yourself, because reality outstrips fiction. Istanbul blends Europe and Asia, tradition and modernity, antiquity and the present. When Dr. Keil arrived in search of Egil's home, he knew he was hunting a needle in a haystack, but sometimes science is ambushed by the improbable. After investigation and interviewing, Dr. Keil did find the famed Egil's residence, and there, exactly as described, stood a 3-story house next door, a dwelling that seemed long abandoned yet matched the boy's depiction. The property sat literally on the water's edge. In front lay a small landing where boats and dinghies could tie up. Behind the house stood a church precisely as he had said. A chill ran through Dr. Keil. How could a child who had never visited Istanbul so accurately portray a specific home in a metropolis? But locating the house was only the start. He still had to learn who had lived there, and that would be the hardest part. He began asking around the neighborhood. No one remembered Armenians living there. Istanbul's Armenian population had diminished sharply over the decades, and the few who remained lived elsewhere. He contacted local Armenian church authorities. They assured him they knew of no Armenians associated with that house. Church records might have helped, but a fire had destroyed part of the historical archive. Dr. Keil began to think he had hit a dead end. Perhaps Kemal was merely a child with an overactive imagination. Perhaps the match with the house was coincidence, nothing more. Then he found a neighborhood elder, a man who had lived there all his life. The elder told him something that set the researcher's heart pounding. Yes, an Armenian had lived in that house many years earlier. The church officials were too young to recall, but he remembered. Keil knew he needed more than a single witness. A serious inquiry cannot rely on one elderly testimony. He needed someone with verifiable historical knowledge of the area. So he returned to Istanbul. Dr. Keil was not the sort to give up. He knew he had found something extraordinary, but science demands solid evidence, not striking coincidences. In 998, he made a second trip. This time, rather than canvassing random locals, he sought experts, regional historians who truly understood the neighborhood's past and its communities. That is how he reached a highly respected local historian. Keil conducted the interview with extreme care. He avoided leading questions, offered no hints, and simply asked whether the historian knew of an Armenian family who had lived in that particular house. What followed was breathtaking. Without hesitation, the historian recounted a story that could have come straight from the boy's mouth. Yes, a wealthy Armenian Christian had indeed lived there, the only Armenian in that entire part of the city. The surname, he said, was Caracas. Keil felt the hairs rise on his arms. The confirmations didn't stop. The historian said the man's wife was Greek Orthodox and her family had disapproved of the marriage. The couple had 3 children, though he did not know their names. Then came the details that left Keil speechless. The Caracas family operated a leather goods business in another district. The man always carried a large leather suitcase, and he stayed in that waterfront house only during the summer months. Keil could barely believe what he was hearing. Every element Kemal had given was being corroborated by an independent, reliable source. The historian added that the man died in 940 or 94, the exact time frame Kemal had mentioned. One mystery remained: the name the boy had supplied for the man, which he said meant "good man" in Armenian. Keil checked, and once again, the child was right. The term Kemal used was indeed an Armenian expression meaning precisely "good man." With each confirmation, the Kemal Atasoy case grew more astonishing and harder to explain by ordinary means. Let's recap the corroborated points. A 3-story house on the waterfront next to Eagle's residence with a church behind. The Caracas family lived there. They dealt in leather. The man carried a leather suitcase and stayed only in summer. His wife was of Greek origin. He died around 940 to 94, and the name given meant "good man" in Armenian. How could a child from a modest family, who had never visited Istanbul or lived among Armenians, know such specific information about a man who died 50 years before his birth? Keil considered every conceivable explanation. Coincidence? Implausible. The details were too precise. Information gleaned from other sources? He himself, an experienced researcher with local contacts, struggled to track it down. Family deceit? Nonsense. The parents had nothing to gain and barely indulged their sons' accounts. Elaborate fantasy? Children do not fabricate verifiable historical particulars about vanished communities in cities they have never seen. Only one hypothesis remained, which, however improbable, fit the observed facts: that the boy was recounting the life of a man he had been before. But Keil was a scientist, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. He decided on a 3rd trip to Istanbul to seek further confirmations, and on this 3rd investigation he would uncover elements that would place this case among the most impressive ever documented in reincarnation research. He aimed to close every loose end. One unresolved piece concerned Kemal's claim that the man's wife and children had Greek names. The historian had affirmed the wife's Greek background but could not verify the names. Keil later found records confirming the wife's Greek Orthodox family. While he could not pin down the children's names, there was evidence they indeed bore Greek names. Another point puzzled him. How could a Turkish child from a Muslim family know specific Armenian terms? Keil examined this carefully. The expression Kemal used was an older Armenian term, obscure even to many modern speakers, and affectionate. Honorific used for someone respected in the community. Whether people actually addressed Mr. Caracas that way could not be directly confirmed, but the appropriateness of the term impressed Keil. As the inquiry advanced, other minor details also checked out. Kemal's description of the neighborhood, nearby streets, and the view from the windows all aligned with reality. Keil broadened his investigation into the Caracas family and found evidence of a leather trade lineage linked to that part of the city. What struck him most was the child's natural ease. It did not sound like rote repetition, it felt like vivid personal recollection. Back in Australia, Keil knew he had documented something extraordinary. This was not merely a curious tale spun by a lively imagination. It was empirical evidence for something most would deem impossible. When Dr. Jürgen Keil presented his findings to the international scientific community, the response mixed fascination with careful skepticism. The implications were too weighty to accept lightly. The case appeared in peer-reviewed journals and at academic conferences. Keil's methodology drew praise. He had tested claims objectively and independently. Dr. Ian Stevenson, of the University of Virginia, regarded Keil's work as exemplary, precisely the caliber of investigation the field requires. Other scholars probed for normal explanations. Could Kemal have acquired the knowledge by ordinary means? Were there hidden family links, books, films, or other sources? These avenues were explored. The family's activities, relationships, and access to information were scrutinized. No conventional source could account for the child's knowledge. The 700-kilometer distance mattered. Kemal was geographically insulated from any local lore about the Caracas family. Skeptics noted that some details might be imprecise or embellished, but even with conservative assumptions, the volume of accurate particulars defied chance. The Atasoy case became one of the most cited in the scientific literature on reincarnation, not because it proved reincarnation, but because it demonstrated phenomena we do not yet fully comprehend. For Keil, the case shifted his own scientific perspective. He began as a healthy skeptic and ended acknowledging that he had encountered something resistant to conventional explanation. I cannot assert with certainty that Kemal is the rebirth of an Armenian man. He would say, but I can state that I documented something I cannot explain by ordinary scientific means. That intellectual honesty is precisely what lends the case its force. And the case does not stand alone. It belongs to a corpus of more than 2,500 similar reports worldwide. The broader pattern shows recurring traits. The age at first reports 2 to 5 years old. Geographic distance reducing the chance of incidental knowledge. Specificity spanning architecture, geography, family, and trade. Internal consistency over years and lack of family incentives. What sets Kemal's story apart is the investigation's quality methodical, independent, and verifiable. Some critics maintain that even well-documented cases may eventually yield normal explanations, perhaps psychological or neurological mechanisms we have not yet mapped, or unknown pathways of information transfer. Science advances by relentless questioning. Still, decades of inquiry have not produced a convincing conventional account for the strongest cases. Parallel instances in India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Thailand, and the United States display a strikingly similar pattern, suggesting we are confronting a genuine phenomenon, not mere folklore or childish reverie. Kemal Atasoy's story forces us to face a primal question. What becomes of consciousness when we die? Do we simply extinguish, or does something endure? Keil's careful work supplies evidence that, at least in some instances, consciousness may survive bodily death and return in a new guise. It is not definitive proof. Science seldom offers certainties on matters so complex, but it is robust enough to merit serious consideration. For skeptics, the case presents stiff challenges. How to account for Kemal's specific, verifiable knowledge of an extinct community in a city he never visited. How to explain the geographic and architectural precision. How to account for his grasp of Armenian terms. For those inclined to believe, the case offers scientific reinforcement and shows that rigorous inquiry can yield results consistent with the continuity of consciousness. Perhaps the most important lesson concerns the nature of science itself. Keil did not set out to validate reincarnation. He applied rigorous methods to extraordinary claims and found that reality can exceed our current frameworks. The case also invites humility. We do not yet grasp the full nature of consciousness, memory, or reality. There remain mysteries beyond present scientific reach. The boy from then now an adult rarely speaks about those early memories. As is typical, they faded with age. He lives an ordinary life, likely without pondering the scientific shockwaves his childhood statements created. For those who studied the matter, however, Kemal Atasoy represents something profound, evidence that our understanding of life and death may be incomplete, that human consciousness may be more enduring than we suppose. We may not have all the answers about rebirth. Perhaps we never will. Yet cases like Kemal's show it is worth continuing to investigate, to question, and to explore the deepest mysteries of human existence. One day we may learn that death is not an ending, but a passage to something new, and perhaps this child, unwittingly, granted us a small window into that extraordinary possibility. Scientific sources: Keil, J., and Tucker, J., 2005. An unusual Turkish case with multiple verified details. Journal of Scientific Exploration. Keil, J., 998-2000. Fieldwork in Istanbul. University of Tasmania reports.